Man, this makes me feel very nostalgic right now. I haven't made a video on standing in front of my game collection, let alone one where I'm in front of the camera. But since 2023 has been such a fantastic year for video games, I decided to go back to my roots and give you one big video. So let's celebrate the top 20 best games of 2023. There seemed to be a weird tradition that every time I'm making my top 10 lists, or top 20 in this case, there's always this one game that everyone loves that I rank much lower than everyone else, and I'm not here to be negative, but I would rather be honest and tell you my personal impressions without feeling that I'm influenced by outside effects at all. With that being said, as much as I hate to do this, let's talk about Final Fantasy XVI.
It's sad because on paper, I should love Final Fantasy XVI. The story's more mature and devoid of the anime tropes that malign some of the previous entries in the series. And despite the shift to real-time action, Square did hire the combat director of Devil May Cry 5, which definitely shows. It looks great, it's well acted, so what exactly is the problem here? Let's start with the story. Clive is a good protagonist, and you have to credit Ben Starr for his excellent performance.
Ben Starr. Star quality, through and through.
The problem is, besides Sid, I didn't connect to any of the side characters, especially Jill, that while I like her, she doesn't really get much to do in the story, which is such a major shame. In fact, the story became more intriguing whenever it didn't focus on Clive and his motley crew, and instead on the opposing factions in the war. And while a lot of them may look like generic villains, it's not just black and white, and there's some interesting revelations in the story that make them much more interesting. As much as I prefer turn-based combat in my Final Fantasy games, I do think the combat in 16 can be fun. However, Clive's basic attack don't change over the 40 plus hours of gameplay. There are extra abilities to unlock, but for the first few hours the selection is rather limited. The game also heavily relies on quick time events that have little to no repercussion of actually failing them. In addition, item and equipment management is superfluous at best, with very few attachments proving even useful. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the pacing. Not only that the cutscenes meander with very little development, but the majority of the side quests, like about 95% of them, are banal fetch quests that are some of the worst of the entire genre. I am bringing all of this up because I genuinely want to love this game. There's some great highlights like fantastic boss fights, some neat plot developments, and some additional challenges like hunting tougher beasts that are extremely satisfying. Final Fantasy XVI is probably my biggest disappointment from 2023, but it isn't without merit. Even if I didn't vibe with Clive's journey like most did, I do hope that maybe the next installment will go back to the roots of what worked. One of the most prominent trends in third-person action games is climbing. Whether it's scaling up a wall or shimmying up a pipe, it's everywhere, but it's never been the main focus. That's the reason why Jusant is such a unique game, because not only that climbing is the focus of the gameplay, but it's also incredibly pragmatic in its approach. The premise is simple: reach the top of the mountain with what might be the longest rope in gaming history. The game looks nice and the minimalistic soundtrack fits, but what really worked for me is the gameplay loop. Each arm is delegated to a trigger button, so alternating between left and right while climbing any surface has this tactile feel to it. The aforementioned seemingly endless rope can not just tether to a safe spot, but you can also use it in a variety of ways, like running on a wall from side to side, or using your body's momentum as you propel yourself back and forth. There are also pegs that you can use as a pseudo checkpoint that allow you to swing from a brand new area on the wall.
Jusant can be kind of tricky when you play it for the first time, but if you persevere, I'm sure you'll get the hang of it. Okay, I haven't done it in a while.
Despite being secured by a rope, I always had that sense of dread that I will mess up and plummet to my doom. I don't think I've had this severe sense of vertigo since I played The Last of Us Part 2, and you should know exactly what part I'm talking about. Still, Jusant is the most zen-like game I've played in 2023. The serene atmosphere combined with the authentic climbing controls made it to one of the most immersive gameplay experiences of the last year. While it may be on the short side, when it comes to climbing, this game is peak. Oh boy! It's time for the internet to grab their pitchforks because I didn't like Pizza Tower like everyone else. But trust me, there is still a lot to love in this game. The visuals are colorful and deranged, evoking that 90s Nicktoons art style. The soundtrack is experimental and catchy, one of the best of the years, and even the controls are just incredibly responsive. So here's the gist. While I do think the gameplay loop of Pizza Tower works incredibly well, it may be a little bit too erratic for its own good. I played various games with flow movements that encourage players to study the level and find the optimal path to speedrun them. And Pizza Tower is just like that, but I feel the flow is a little bit more demanding than I expected. Games like Neon White do require players to repeat levels over and over again, but those usually are over in a minute. Pizza Tower levels can last upwards to 10 minutes, and getting a perfect score in those is much more difficult. The other reason could be a technical one, but my PC had issues that caused the motion to be extremely unpleasant to my eyesight. I do hope that maybe one day we'll get a console release so I don't have to rely on my aging laptop. Hey there, future Daniel here. Since I finished editing this video, the Switch version of Pizza Tower came out, and while the framerate was much more consistent, my opinion of the game hasn't changed all that much, so it's gonna remain in the same spot, sorry. And it's such a shame because I love the insane premise. Playing as a crazy chef who must traverse a treacherous tower filled with unique levels, and no gimmick ever repeats itself. From a Wild West saloon to a golf session with a cheese curd, the game always keeps you on your toes. This is one of those games I can see myself going back to it and will rank much higher in hindsight, but I have to be honest with my opinions about it as of right now in this video. That being said, Pizza Tower is an absolute delight, and you all deserve a slice of the action. Despite how people know me as a Sega fan, there are many of their franchises that I never really dabbled in. There's so little time in the world to play everything nowadays. But I did finally make my maiden voyage in the Dreamcast classic Jet Set Radio. While I appreciate this game's production values, especially for their time, the game definitely aged in several spots. But thanks to some devoted fans, we now have a spiritual successor that fixes a lot of those issues in Bomb Rush Cyberfunk. The protagonist Red and his ragtag crew must tag as many points in the city as they can. That way they can claim more territory, but they have to be careful before the fuzz busts them. From the vibrant cel-shaded graphics to the upbeat techno soundtrack, the Jet Set Radio influences are on full blast. But it's not just a beautiful looking homage, it also feels like a true modern interpretation of the classic formula. Linking tricks is much easier to do, and with a combination of a jetpack that allows dashing forward, you can make some sick combos. I was never a fan of the graffiti mechanic in the original game since it sort of halted the action, but tagging in Bomb Rush is so quick and immediate that it feels far more rewarding. When the game focuses solely on exploration and platforming, it gets full marks. However, the moment combat is added to the mix, so do the problems. Now I get it, you're a youth vandalizing property, so naturally the Force would be giving chase. But being interrupted in the middle of a trick combo or a big jumps just to perform attacks heavily disrupts the flow. Not to mention, when you do try to attack enemies, the combat is incredibly sluggish. But at least it's fine that they can be beat by a punk with a spray can. If you've been a long-time fan of the Jet Set Radio franchise, Bomb Rush Cyberpunk is incredibly faithful to that legacy. And it's worth playing just for the trip-inducing sequences alone. So grab your favorite extreme gear, drop some paint, and don't forget to watch your back.
Watch your back, yo, watch your back, yo, you better watch your back, yo, watch your back, yo, you better watch your back, yo, watch your back, yo.
I've been a fan of Mortal Kombat since my childhood, when I played the original game on the Sega Genesis. Which may have been inappropriate for my age, but please don't tell my mom! Nevertheless, despite some bumps on the road, NetherRealm Studios found the sweet spot in 2011 with a Mortal Kombat reboot, and perhaps made the best game in the franchise. Followed by the now underrated X and the disappointing 11, a lot was riding on the next installment, Mortal Kombat 1. Touted as a reboot for the Mortal Kombat lore, I was especially curious to see how the story of a new universe would unfold. Let me cut straight to the chase. Mortal Kombat 1's story mode starts on a great note. There are a lot of unique takes on the familiar formula, like how Liu Kang is now the Elder God, and Raiden is the up-and-coming champion.
The production values of the story mode are sublime, and the voice acting, top-notch.
We can't help what we are. That we feed on blood doesn't make us evil.
Except you. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm actually missing Ronda Rousey right now.
I also want to give a special shout out to Alan Lee, who steals the show as Shang Tsung. It's really hard to fill the shoes of the great Hiroyuki Tagawa, but Lee captures his slimy and aristocratic delivery to a T.
I am sure you're asking yourself, can I afford to trust a man I have never met? But the true question you must ask is, can I afford not to?
I focus on the story so much because, quite frankly, I didn't vibe with the actual combat of Mortal Kombat. I don't claim to be a fighting game expert, so I don't expect you to explain the minutia here, but something about this system just didn't work for me. In previous games, you can use a portion of your bar to power up your special moves, but for some reason in this game, while you can still do that, they feel a lot weaker, so it becomes much less satisfying. Also, although they're a neat fan service, I'm just not a big fan of the cameo system. Most of the time, it's just hard to find the right moment to summon them and they just run away. The rest of the single-player offerings don't fare much better. Invasions mode runs incredibly slow, and they try to add all those RPG mechanics like items and elemental attacks, I guess. But they really don't add much in the grand scheme of things, they just fight random opponents and win. There's still some cute minigames in this mode, but it overall feels like one giant grind. And speaking of grind, do you remember the Crypt? You know, that awesome mode that was in every Mortal Kombat game that you unlock cool stuff like scorpion cooking? Well, that is now reduced to a gacha game. We get a random reward from a fountain! Yay! Mortal Kombat 1 should have been a wonderful celebration of Mortal Kombat, especially for its 30th anniversary. But I will definitely say it does a lot of right things despite my complaints. The story mode production values are some of the best in the video game industry. The cast of characters for the most part is unique. I mean, whoever expected Havoc of all characters to come back? And it still manages to strike that balance between overly gory to cheesy and fun. It does a lot of great things that other fighting games wish they could achieve, And in reality, you can probably throw all my qualms out of the window anyways, because you get to beat the crap out of Homelander, and that is worth the price of admission alone.
You got spunk for an old man. I like that.
Well, you're a cocky prick, and I loathe you.
After I was let down by Sonic Frontiers, Sonic Superstars brought the series back to its roots. Though I would be the first to admit it reminds me less of the 16-bit classics and more of Sonic 4. But still, even with the imprecise physics, the questionable boss fights, and the occasional mediocre music, it was still an enjoyable experience. That didn't make the list. No, what's actually more surprising is that the smaller scale Apple Arcade only Sonic game, Sonic Dream Team, did make it on my list. But I do have one very important disclaimer.
I am not a big fan of the Apple Arcade at all. Not only that the game selection feels incredibly lacking, which makes sense as a lot of those games were mobile game first, but the interface is incredibly slow, laggy, and unresponsive, and I've had many occasions where games downright crashed on me for no apparent reason. It's a shame that such a great Sonic game, heck, maybe one of the best Sonic games in years, is stuck on this platform. And at the time of this video, it's exclusive to this thing, but I sure hope that maybe in 2025 it might escape the Apple Arcade prison.
Now that I've aired all of my woes, I can finally say that this game is pretty good. Sonic Dream Team has a more open level design, more reminiscent of the two adventure games and Heroes, and less like the rigid and linear Boost era games. The levels in Dream Team are very wide with a lot of different paths, and each set of characters have their own unique abilities, such as Sonic and Amy being able to dash through rings, and I gotta say, this game probably handled that mechanic the best out of any Sonic game. And despite all those different characters, the game controls surprisingly pretty well. The camera can still be a pain to deal with, but almost every single jump I try to make or lock into a specific target connected without much anguish. While I love playing as multiple characters and for once they all actually control incredibly well, it's just a shame that in order to swap between them you have to stand in place, which I think is one of the game's worst attributes. The various dreamscapes in the game look absolutely amazing, bursting with color, and the framerate is very stable too. Sadly, and this might be a shocker for longtime Sonic fans, the soundtrack is actually not very good, and I had a lot of issues with the mixing in particular, but hey, at the very least, the main theme slaps pretty hard. Sonic Dream Team managed to go against all odds. With a meager budget on a dubious machine, it manages to surpass many of its bigger mainline siblings. Shockingly, this might be the best Sonic game I've played since Sonic Mania in 2017. As much as I would like to recommend this game, I understand why people don't want to shell out the money for an Apple Arcade subscription, let alone an iDevice like an Apple TV. But if this game ever gets a multi-platform release, all of my dreams will come true. I remember when Cocoon won the best indie game of 2023, and many people were baffled to say the least. After all, considering the amount of hype that Pizza Tower was garnering, having a game with little to no fanfare just sweep the trophy felt strange. What's even stranger is that I actually liked Cocoon more than I did Pizza Tower, something that I would never expect to say considering my love of platformers. And yet Cocoon is one of the most unique experiences I've played from the last year. Cocoon takes place in a system of alien planets, and while it may look like another top-down adventure game, its core gimmick is one of the coolest mechanics of the year. I won't forget stepping on the first glowing pad and jumping out of the entire world. Not to mention, as I witnessed this orange sphere That is literally the same world I just inhabited a second ago. It's insane how those snow globe-like spheres harbor entire ecosystems inside, filled with exotic creatures and mesmerizing locales. The sense of scope is something to behold, as it never seems to amaze me how I'm carrying this entire world in my hands and using it as just a simple switch to activate a platform or cross a bridge. While I do admit I get stumped with puzzle games, Cocoons were intuitive and a joy to solve. Each time a new sphere was introduced with a brand new mechanic, I was ecstatic to see the new ways I can utilize it. My only gripe with the game are the occasional boss battles. Having to restart an entire encounter after getting hit a single time can be rather disheartening. Cocoon isn't a very long game, ending in just a few hours, but it's also a game that comes highly recommended due to its ease of access and inventive mechanics. Each area is both eerie yet fascinating to witness, which leads to both visually and mentally stimulating experience. If you play this game, it'll be obvious to see why this cocoon can become the most beautiful butterfly. Street Fighter V wasn't beloved upon release, especially due to the fact it was feature-barren. Sure, years later and 5 managed to improve significantly since its mediocre launch, but if you want fans to champion your game, their first impression is incredibly critical. Good thing that Capcom learned the lesson pretty quickly. Street Fighter VI is a return to form for the venerable franchise, but even I will admit I was a tad worried at first.
When I saw the cover of Street Fighter VI and learned that Luke is the poster boy now, I was definitely concerned. A DLC character from Street Fighter V has now been elevated to main protagonist status. What is it, Street Fighter 3 and everyone that we know is pretty much gone at this point? Well, thankfully, not only did the 8 original characters from Street Fighter 2 return, but the new cast introduced in this game is pretty spectacular.
I was pleasantly surprised to find how deep the World Tour mode is. As the dedicated single-player campaign, it might not have the production values of a NetherRealm studio game, but it still has plenty to offer. From creating your own Street Fighter avatar, exploring the various areas, fighting random passerbys, partaking in fun minigames, and perhaps the best part, getting tutored by Street Fighter alumni. Throughout the respectable length of the World Tour, you encounter various characters that will teach you moves, which allows you to composite your own move list, which is incredibly cool. I also think the shift to the drive system in 6 is much better and easier to grasp. It's simple to counter a rampaging enemy that just barrages you with multiple hits, build up your drive meter, and then unleash a flurry of devastating blows. Oh, it's so good! With a bevy of modes, a solid online play, and an extremely sleek UI that may rival Persona 5, Street Fighter VI proved that the progenitor of fighting games hasn't lost a bit of its mojo. The champion's back and here to stay. The Super Nintendo has a lot of classics, and many of them happen to be turn-based RPGs. Unfortunately, growing up as a Sega kid prevented me from experiencing any of them, besides a few hours with Chrono Trigger. I'm saying all of this because I have zero nostalgia to that particular era of RPGs, and yet I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Sea of Stars. Sabotage Studios' sophomore release is a love letter to the aforementioned RPGs of yore. The pixel art graphics are absolutely breathtaking. It manages to evoke that classic style of that era, while also being modern with incredibly smooth animation. The soundtrack is also worth celebrating, especially since one of the composers is Yasunori Mitsuda of Chrono Trigger fame. I always love the active participation in turn-based battles, that whenever you attack or even block, by pressing the button at the right moment, you can either inflict more damage or defend better respectively. While each character has their own special move, some can perform a combo attack with a different character, and those can really turn the tide of battle. And I absolutely like stopping an enemy's special move altogether. all that's necessary is to use the right attack type on the corresponding block. If all the blocks are destroyed before the turn timer gets to 0, not only the special move is cancelled, but the enemy's turn is skipped altogether. And yes, I love the gameplay so much, which is why the story was a little bit disappointing. The characters aren't bad, and the writing can provide a chuckle here and there. I just think as a whole the story is rather rudimentary. Especially since the villains are rather bland and they don't really have much of a presence overall. So I admit, this plot isn't exactly what I would call memorable, except for Garl, and here's why. His best friends are becoming badass super monks with mystical powers that are destined to save the world, and he is just a regular guy, not receiving a similar boon. He has every right to be jealous and vindictive, but he chooses to support his friends and even join them on their journey and become their personal chef. While being overly positive can be interpreted as toxic, Garl is very endearing and easily the best written character in the entire story, which makes me wish the others got similar treatment. Even with my minuscule qualms, I enjoyed the journey immensely. And heck, even as someone who doesn't usually play those minigames in those big lengthy adventures, I spent a lot of hours on wheels. It's surprisingly very addicting. Sea of Stars is my favorite indie game of 2023, and if you are even the most casual fan of those old school RPGs, this is one of the most wonderful homages you can possibly play. In the past, I tended to exclude any remakes in my top lists. That's because I thought awarding a game that uses a prior foundation of a previous release was sort of a gray area. But I made some exceptions, like the remakes for Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII, due to how the entire foundation of the game changed so drastically that it was pretty much a brand new release. Most remakes don't do that and they just suffice with graphical shine, but some provide subtle nuances to make the experience worthwhile, just like the Dead Space remake. The original Dead Space, despite its age, holds up okay, but as soon as I put it next to the remake, the differences become a little bit more obvious. EA Motive added a lot of subtle yet important changes to make this the definitive Dead Space experience.
One of my favorite things about the Dead Space remake is the fact that Isaac Clarke can actually talk.
While I was never the biggest fan of silent protagonists, I do think they can work in some instances, like creating your own avatar. But for a character with a pivotal role in the story, it feels off when someone talks to Isaac and he's just standing there not emoting at all. It's refreshing to see Isaac Clarke being an active participant since he's the main character, you know? And he even takes initiative instead of being ordered around all the time like in the original.
Corporate wouldn't send the Ishimura for some off-the-books mining. But alien technology, yeah, that fits.
And how does losing my team fit into this theory?
Hey, knock this shit off. We're into the debris field. We get the ADS back together, or it's over.
Other changes include weapons that appear in the environment itself, as opposed to being yet another shop item. Some frustrating sections in the original were removed in favor of much more exciting alternatives. And some other smaller scale changes like having to reroute lighting circuits in order to make some areas open up in favor of making everything dark as heck. The game is gorgeous, especially with its lighting engine. The sound design is exquisite and definitely contributes to the horror atmosphere. And it's shocking how there's little to no loading time despite the seemingly big areas. At the end of the day, this is still the same tightly designed game from 15 years ago. But by getting rid of all the fat from the original release, streamlining the experience, and giving it a shiny coat of paint, this is no doubt the best way to experience the massacre on the Ishimura. We can argue until the cows come home whether or not the Dead Space remake was even necessary, but it did cement this title as one of the most seminal action horror games of all time. Despite my affinity to role-playing games, I've never gotten into D&D before. Maybe it's because I was never a board game guy, but I admit all different rules absolutely intimidated me. And then suddenly, Baldur's Gate 3, a long-awaited sequel to a series that I have never played, took the entire world by storm. So much so that it actually usurped Tears of the Kingdom as the game of 2023, which I personally thought was an impossible task. I wanted to play it too, but I also ran into a complication.
I don't think I've exhibited such patience as I did with Baldur's Gate 3. As you see, I'm holding the physical edition in my hand. Even with Alan Wake 2, at the time of this video, I don't have the physical edition and had to buy it digitally, only to find out it's coming physically a couple of months later. But with Baldur's Gate 3, after I saw how much Larian was putting so much effort into the physical edition, I didn't mind the wait. So I placed my order in January, and unfortunately I only got it in July, but I didn't mind the 6 months wait because at the end of the day, this right here is one of the most refined and unique gameplay experiences I've ever had in my life, and it's an absolute keeper.
There is a lot to cover with this game, and trust me, I was very overwhelmed at first, but I'm so glad I gave it a fair chance. Let's start with some of the technical aspects. For a game this massive, I'm amazed of how beautiful it is. Character models are detailed, the locations are unique for one another, and while there are loading times, they're pretty brief all things considered. The music fits with the fantasy setting, but I have to commend the superb voice work. The script is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but the actors embodying the characters truly bring them to life. Let's put it this way, I knew from the first second Astarion is gonna be a sleazeball, but Neil Newbone's flamboyant and yet intense performance made me want this particular douche as a permanent fixture in my party no matter what.
So, we've picked up a wizard who managed to get stuck in his own portal. Hardly a promising introduction.
And it's so fun to do his voice, darling. I was pleasantly surprised to see how exploring areas or conversing with townsfolk is a key element of this game. For example, you can go to a shopkeeper and buy items the traditional way, or talk to the keeper and have someone else pickpocket them in the meantime. I also love avoiding combat by talking my way out of a bad situation, and granted a lot of those times revolve around the roll of a die, which can be detrimental, but when you do successfully intimidate or persuade an enemy to retreat, it's oh so satisfying. I never played many CRPGs before, being a console peasant after all, but despite the growing pains, I did manage to understand a sizable portion of the system. From knowing what weapons or spells to equip, their effect on enemies, positioning on the map, or even how to use the environment at the right opportunity. Even if my class choice of Monk felt limited in some areas, I had party members picking up the slack in others, like Best Girl Shadowheart as a trusty healer. I don't think I've ever played a game as robust and deep as Baldur's Gate 3. The open-endedness on display is absolutely insane. There are a lot of games that try to sell the illusion of free choice, but no game has went as above and beyond as this. There is a staggering amount of different side quests that heavily alter depends on the choice you, the player, make in the game. The main reason, unlike many, this isn't my favorite game of the year is purely personal. I do wish the game steadily funneled all of the information instead of just pouring everything right away. And having to refer to a guide or a friend every moment just to understand something took me out of the experience. But I can't deny the fact that the amount of effort, passion, and love poured into Baldur's Gate 3 is substantial. If anything, it proves that turn-based combat was never a bad thing to begin with.
You heard that, Final Fantasy 16?
The fact that the sequel to my #1 game of 2018 didn't even make it to my top 5 is a ludicrous thought, until you see the competition. Regardless, this fan-pleasing sequel will satisfy any webhead out there, and there's several reasons to why. Obviously, it wouldn't be a cool sequel if Peter or Miles wouldn't have new gadgets to toy around with. Best being the wingsuit, which allows the Spider-Man to glide across New York City like Knuckles did in Kidna. And I mean all of New York this time, as there are additional boroughs to explore like Queens. Combat is as fluid and dynamic as it always been, with Miles being able to use his trademark electric venom powers, and Peter now uses, robotic spider arms, I guess. Okay, to be honest, Miles is just more fun to play than Peter since his powers are more entertaining to use. And he has invisibility, which is very useful during the stealth missions. Peter can still use the gadgets he had in the last game, but since Miles also has access to them, it doesn't make him very unique in comparison. At least until the second half of the game kicks in. On the other hand, I think Peter's story is much better than Miles's. As much as I was worried about another Spider-Man sequel involving Harry Osborn popping out of nowhere, at least I enjoyed how the two's friendship is tested throughout the game. Miles does get a few moments to shine, but his story definitely takes a backseat to Peter. But enough about the negativity, because there's a lot to love in Spider-Man 2. Doing the side content in this game can be just as fun as the main campaign. And a clear testament to that is the amount of people who managed to get a platinum trophy in this game. There are a lot of unique set pieces, and the cinematics are gorgeous, accompanied by a stellar voice cast.
Let's go, man, before he gets too far.
No. He's mine.
You sure? He's got big teeth.
So do I.
And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Spider-Man 2 is arguably one of the most beautiful games of all time. I can't even fathom how gigantic this game is, and yet it's able to hold a steady frame rate of 60 FPS. And if you need further proof, just check the instantaneous fast travel. Even after the 500th time, I still don't know how Insomniac pulled this off. It's only natural that after 3 installments, the series is gonna show some signs of fatigue, but Marvel's Spider-Man 2 still remains as one of the most entertaining superhero games of all time. And dare I say, it's a marvel. Ever since From Software managed to strike gold with Dark Souls, every company wanted to have their own Souls-like. Many tried, but few managed to reach a similar success. I've been known on this channel to preach the good name of Neo, which means, yep, it's 0 days since I last mentioned Neo, but thankfully now we have another great Souls-like to add to the fray, The Lies of P.
Pedo's puppet. We need your help.
But I do have a confession to make about The Lies of P. I originally thought this game is gonna be a movie tie-in to The Life of Pi, the Ang Lee movie with the kid and the tiger, and I was pretty far away from the truth. But it does still have a Hollywood icon in it. Timothée Chalamet.
The game takes place in the fictional city of Krot, where mechanical puppets serve humanity. However, the city of Krot is ravaged due to a puppet frenzy, and it's up to the special puppet P to solve the crisis. The story very loosely follows the tales of Pinocchio, and some familiar faces may appear frequently. While the narrative is understated like similar games of its kin, the environments are the real star of the show. Every area in Krot is fully realized and it's just a joy to explore. Besides the traditional Souls-like gameplay of slashing and avoiding attacks, Lies of P features a unique take on weapons. Each one is comprised by a blade and a handle, and they can be mixed and matched to various effects. Not only that the wind-up animation changes drastically based on the handle chosen, but each one unlocks a special attack that can either buff P or unleash a devastating blow. There are so many other combat abilities like P's prosthetic arm that elevates this game beyond the traditional Souls-like. Last thing I need to touch on is that this game is, well, very hard. Now, I know calling those games hard is like saying Sonic the Hedgehog is blue, but I see more people compare this game to Bloodborne, especially because of its Victorian setting, as opposed to the game that I do think takes more inspiration from, Sekiro. That is due to how parrying the enemies, and especially the bosses, is extremely vital. The room for error to execute a perfect parry is extremely limited, so I would not recommend Lies of P to a beginner compared to the more inviting Elden Ring. That being said, rarely did I feel the game pulled a fast one on me, and I did improve my reflexes every time I died. I remember the main complaint with Lies of P was its linear approach to game design, but personally, I disagree. Not only I enjoyed exploring all the areas in the game due to how beautiful they are, but the majority of them had diverging paths in which you can unlock shortcuts or brand new treasures to find. Look, I love Elden Ring, but one of my complaints with that game was the lack of unique dungeons, and many of the areas felt very derivative of one another. Lies of P proves that there is still room in the world for a classic Souls-like level design, and not every game has to be open world to remain engaging. If you're up to the challenge, Lies of P is one of the best action games, and is the closest one of those Souls-like to have ever come close to Nioh. And if you know me, that is a huge compliment.
Back to the beginning. We all come to a story with hopes and expectations, looking for an answer. Sometimes it would be better to live with that hope without ever knowing the full story.
The phrase style over substance is often used as a negative, but in the case of Alan Wake 2, while there is a lot of substance, the style of this game is off the charts. In this sequel that shifted to a more survival horror focused gameplay, players will get to control not only Alan Wake himself, but also a determined FBI agent named Saga Anderson. Both characters have separate story paths, and players can alternate between them for the majority of the game. I actually want to speak as little as possible about Alan Wake 2, not because there isn't much to talk about, oh boy is there a lot to talk about, but a lot of this game's appeal is jumping without knowing what is gonna happen next. Though I couldn't be helped but be spoiled about the We Sing chapter, considering the fact it was one of the best things the Game Awards has ever done. But that's the point about Alan Wake 2. At its core, it is a horror game with a lot of twists and turns, but it isn't shy about poking fun at itself. This game is sort of a magnum opus to Remedy Entertainment as a studio, and I could go on and on about all the references it has. But one of my personal favorite is including the late and great James McCaffrey as Alex Casey, who originally voiced Max Payne more than 2 decades ago.
The Fed had witnessed something here that made him run scared. Whether the summoning ritual had been a bona fide supernatural event or the mass psychosis of stark raving lunatics, it didn't change the facts. The cult was messing with things no one should mess with.
The main reason why Alan Wake 2 isn't higher on my list is honestly the gameplay. While it is a major improvement over the original game in that department, the combat is still nothing special. It borrows heavily from Resident Evil 2 Remake, and you can tell it immediately with the UI, but my problem is that those annoying axe-throwing enemies from the original game are back, and enemy attacks are much harder to avoid because the dodging window is smaller than usual. But even with its combat woes, I still enjoyed exploring this nightmarish world. Using Alan's ability to rewrite the story and manipulate the world is such an inventive mechanic. And Saga, being an investigator, can go to her personal mind space in order to piece all the evidence she finds in order to find the solution to this weird case. Alan Wake 2 is just a tour de force when it comes to its narrative, and experiencing the story is worth the price of admission alone. This is Remedy Entertainment's personal thank you letter for all the fans that have followed them over the years. And to show my own token of gratitude, I'm going to become the Champion of Light.
Is it
Yep.
profession rock star?
Future rockstar.
Are you done?
Yes.
It's hard to avoid leaks, especially before a big presentation by the main three, but sometimes when a genuine surprise occurs, we all win. Hi-Fi Rush came out of nowhere, and from Tango Gameworks of all studios, which are known for their more, macabre taste when it comes to their aesthetics. The game stars Chai, a himbo doofus who wants to become a rock star despite lacking any musical talent. Very relatable. But what he lacks in intelligence, he more than makes up for it with his cheerful attitude, as he's roped into an adventure trying to stop the evil Vandalay Corporation. Many games attempt to write humor with mixed results, and by mixed I mean mostly mediocre. Hi-Fi Rush is a genuinely funny game. From the terrifically hilarious cast headlined by Robbie Damon, which might be my favorite role of his ever, and the phenomenal animation that brings every single motion to life. I have never fell in love so quickly with a cast like I did with Hi-Fi Rush, and even in the quieter scene that not much goes on, just the conversation are instantly endearing. And even the villains get a chance to shine, and they definitely steal a lot of scenes too. Especially my girl Corsica. Oh boy, that accent, I melt.
Take a nap and get the Spectra nonsense out of your system. First thing tomorrow's your last chance to come clean.
The rhythm-based combat is an innovative take on the hack-and-slash formula. Pressing the button on the right beat can lead to high scores. I admit, my sense of rhythm isn't exactly the best, especially when it comes to a game where I also need to keep track of the enemies. But the timing doesn't have to be perfect, as the game adjusts the tempo based on the player's button presses. Chai can also summon one of his buddies doing combat to either inflict more damage or take care of a nasty shield. He can also perform various special moves that shred enemies in more ways than one. Even outside of combat, it's just fun to control Chai, as his jumping controls are mostly precise, and he also gets a hook shot, and you know what I think about those at this point. Originally when I wrote this script, I was going off and on about the closure of Tango Gameworks, but as of this video, the studio is back and we might actually get more of this wonderful world. If you enjoy rhythm games, action games, or just want to play something that will put a smile on your face, there is no other game that would give you a rush quite like this.
Whoa, this is crazy. Looks like we found our AI.
This is a screensaver, Chai.
It's hard to believe it's been a whole decade since the last Pikmin game sprouted on the scene. I really liked Pikmin 3, but I do think Nintendo tried to bring the series back to basics and remove a lot of things. I am bringing this up because not only that Pikmin 4 brought up some of the features that I've missed so much, but it's a wonderful culmination of the entire franchise. What makes Pikmin 4 such a great game is the sheer amount of activities to do. The most obvious one being growing the Pikmin army, and there are some new additions such as the Ice Pikmin that freeze water. There's also a massive amount of treasure to collect, some might be familiar to those Nintendo diehards out there. In addition, the dungeons are back! They are still as fun to explore as they were 20 years ago in Pikmin 2. And while time moves much slower there is also severely limited access to extra Pikmin. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the best doggo of the year, Ochi. Initially I thought his addition would dumb down the game significantly, but I can't even imagine a Pikmin game now without him. Being able to move faster while carrying a massive batch of Pikmin, breaking barriers with his rush attack, or even dig or carry heavy treasures. There are also the night missions that play similarly like a tower defense game. Well, I'm not a huge fan of those kind of games, but it adds a Pikmin spin that lets you control the action far better. especially since you can use your faithful army to unleash the Giant Ball of Doom. There are also Dandori challenges in which you either have to defeat a computer AI or score the most points to win medals. As a member of the prestigious rescue team, you must also retrieve survivors that were stranded on the planet. If you save them, they can give you more quests to gain more experience or abilities to further help you in your adventure. My main gripe with the game, though, is probably the story. I just think there is a little bit too much dialogue, especially towards the beginning, and it's not as clever as it used to be in the prior 3 games. But with all that said and done, Pikmin 4 is an excellent game that, despite its small stature, will give you an abundant amount of enjoyment. Just, Nintendo, please don't wait another decade for the next one. Giant robots are pretty darn cool, that's a no-brainer. However, mech games as a whole were never truly beloved critically. The only series that I recall got a decent amount of praise back in the day were the Mechasoul duology. And since that series ended in 2004, mech games never really truly rose to the mainstream. Even From Software's own Armored Core franchise, despite its venerable history, never truly got the appreciation it deserved, mine included. But when Armored Core 6 was announced in the Game Awards back in 2002, I wanted to see what I missed. And I dabbled in some of the original games, and while they didn't age the most gracefully, building the ultimate mech and engaging in high-octane combat is incredibly addicting. And even though it's been dormant for a whole decade, From Software proved they can create quality titles that are not just a part of the Soulsborne series, and use the lessons learned from those titles to create an excellent mech action game. Let's get straight to the chase. Armored Core 6 is not a Souls game. It's a fast-paced action game filled with giant robots blasting the ever-loving crap of one another. One would expect those big metal ACs to move like lumbering buildings, but the movement is perhaps the best part of the entire game. Dodging attacks left and right, or even boosting at blistering speeds, is some of the most fun I've experienced last year. In fact, the game is easily the most approachable game in the entire series, since death doesn't result in failure, and players are encouraged to experiment with a broad variety of parts. From different weapons like handguns and laser cannons, or changing your parts like your legs or your arms in order to improve your stats. Because who doesn't want to be a mech with giant tank tracks? The one Souls-like element that was introduced in this game is the stagger meter. The more damage inflicted to an AC, the more the bar is gonna fill up. Once full, the AC will become staggered and be susceptible to more damage. That means there are gonna be some enemies that will take forever to chip their health, but using the right weapons to stagger them can be much more beneficial. Even if the story is only told via radio comms, the melodramatic yet earnest delivery makes the journey entertaining at least.
One of the ways that I was gauging how I'm gonna rank each different game in my top 20 is whether or not I would want to play it again. And since I only got one of the 3 endings in Armored Core 6, I definitely want to replay it more because it's incredibly fun. Just boosting around, flying all over the place, slashing and shooting robots to pieces is just so exhilarating. I'm gonna say this right now, I'm christening this as the best mech game of all time, and I am not saying this lightly.
That was just a glimpse. A premonition of the storm of flame that will burn Rubicon.
Oh, would you look at that. Tears of the Kingdom isn't my number 1. And this time I can't use a Sonic game coming out as an excuse. And I know what you might be thinking. Is it because of the weapon degradation is back? No, on the contrary. Link's abilities in this game are some of the most creative in video game history, and Fuse in particular fixes that aforementioned problem. Collecting different ore and monster parts felt a lot more useful in this game, since I can use those to forge brand new weapons. I barely used elemental arrows in Breath of the Wild because they were so scarce and hard to come by. But using elemental fruits to create them is not just easier, but far more economical. The recall power can be used to reverse specific items in time, whether it's to turn back a moving cog, or even lift yourself up to the sky using a block that previously fell. Ascending vertically to higher areas is never dull, and finding ways to close that gap so you can actually activate this power is incredibly fun and inventive. But of course, let's talk Ultra Hand. This was touted as what if Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was actually good, but I think that undersells how incredibly imaginative this power truly is. Combining almost any object in the world and creating a near limitless amount of contraptions is downright insane. Granted, I was never really a fan of building anything in video games, which is why I was never part of the Minecraft crowd. But despite my shoddy construction skills, even my most mediocre contraptions were pretty useful. From attaching a rocket to a platform in order to cross a chasm, or creating a flying bike, imagination is the only ceiling for creation. Putting all the new powers aside, Totk is a more refined gameplay experience than its predecessor. A lot of the gimmick shrines of Breath of the Wild have been removed, equaling some of the more complex overworld puzzle that felt more arduous than fun. Combat shrines alone are a major improvement since you have to defeat all the enemies in a room with a limited amount of equipment and in your underwear only. Exploring the depths of Hyrule is both rewarding and foreboding. This gargantuan area may be intimidating, but exploring its mysteries definitely holds great rewards, especially to those who can brave the challenge. And I just love the Sky Islands, but I really wish there were just more of them. And they even brought the temples back, and yeah, they're not all winners, but they're the home to some great puzzles that I enjoyed solving. Can't say I'm a fan of the story though. I understand that just like Breath of the Wild, progression isn't linear, but a lot of the cutscenes convey the same information, only with slight presentation differences. There is, however, one revelation that is well earned, and is perhaps one of the best moments in any Zelda game to date. Totk is a massive achievement in both scope and mechanics. While not everything works like its UI or narrative and the combat has pretty much no changes whatsoever, the fact the game is this polished despite running on the aging Switch hardware is remarkable to say the least. I do hope the next Zelda game features some brand new locations, since recycling the same map from the previous title can only work for so long. But considering all the improvements implemented, the new abilities, and just overall quality, there's no need to shed a tear over this monumental success. There used to be this golden age for Mario platformers. Both the NES and the Super NES harbored some of the best platformers of all time. But since then, I wasn't the biggest fan of Mario's 2D escapades. They filled the quota, but they seemed to follow the same formula, like a product coming out of a conveyor belt being mass-produced.
And that is why I'm so excited to talk about my favorite Mario game in quite a while, which is Super Mario Wonder. Or should I say Super Mario Bros. Wonder? I don't know. I think everyone I know calls this game Mario Wonder, so why add the Bros there? It just feels kind of extraneous. Just adding extra words. But not for the first time I'm doing this in my videos. I digress.
Let's get the obvious out of the way. This game is absolutely gorgeous. Between the new character designs and the exotic vistas of the new Flower Kingdom, it breathes brand new life into the franchise with new locations and even enemies to see. But if you really want to be stunned, look no further than the Wonder Flower gimmick. And yes, it is a gimmick, but not all gimmicks are inherently bad. The idea that every Wonder Flower can affect either the characters or the environment in a unique and outlandish way keeps the adventure feel fresh throughout. I don't want to spoil all the surprises, but let's just say if you ever wanted to hear a Piranha Plant chorus, now you can. But having style can only carry you so far, and thankfully Mario Wonder also plays phenomenally well. The controls are tight, and jumping is as precise as it's ever been. The elephant power-up definitely became one of the most infamous additions to this game, since you can break walls or spray water with your trunk, but both the bubble and drill power-ups are excellent additions to Mario's arsenal as well. The new batch mechanic can also give Mario and his friends an additional ability that can be beneficial in different levels, such as a higher jump, or a vine that Mario can shoot like a hookshot. And you know what I think about hookshots. And one of the most fascinating features to this game is its online multiplayer. And no, I'm not joking. In a very similar implementation of the Souls games of all things, players can witness the ghosts of other characters playing simultaneously. So if you die at any point, said players can revive you. Not to mention the same players can leave a signpost that can serve as an additional checkpoint. This may sound like Mario Wonder is easy, but considering the vast amount of levels, collectibles, and later challenges, you will need any advantage you can get. Super Mario Bros. Wonder is one of the best Mario games ever made. The creativity and imagination just pours from every corner, and it doesn't lose its luster throughout its runtime. I would even go as far to say this is the best 2D Mario game since Super Mario World all the way back in 1991. This game is a must-own for the Switch, and there is no better adjective to describe it but wonderful.
Ugh. You know, I hate myself sometimes. Do you remember in the past when I used to have caveats where I don't include ports and remasters in my lists because, well, those games came out in the past and they only have minor changes at best? But with remakes, it's a little bit different because they can change the foundation altogether, which is why I included some in the past, including one in this particular video. But I never thought I would place one so incredibly high on my list. It just feels unfair with all the amazing games that we got. And yet I have to say this, Resident Evil 4 Remake not only made one of my favorite games of all time just as adequate as it was in 2005, it made it even better, and I hate myself for that.
I, like many, thought that remaking Resident Evil 4 felt like a Sisyphean task for a couple of reasons. First, there are other games in the series that would rather benefit the remake treatment, like Resident Evil 0 or Code Veronica. And second, why do we need to improve on perfection?
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
But at the end of the day, the changes made to Resident Evil 4 Remake are clever and effective. The story, while still retaining some of its camp moments, is taken a bit more seriously this time around. Especially the way they handled Ashley, who is portrayed less like a damsel in distress and more like a capable ally to Leon. And while I do think the remake handles her and Luis incredibly well, some characters, and especially the villains, are surprisingly understated, which is rather disappointing. But even with my woes, this story doesn't repeat the original beat by beat, and it does address some plot holes that were never talked about in the original game, like Leon's relationship with Krauser. And of course I can talk about how beautiful this game is and how amazing it sounds, but I really want to focus on the gameplay. I replayed the original RE4 in 2022 in preparation for the remake, and being able to shoot only when you're in aiming mode definitely felt dated. However, what made the original RE4 so great is the fact that the enemy AI worked in tandem with this mechanic, so they don't just storm at Leon due to his still movement. In return, the remake modernizes the controls, allowing Leon to shoot and move at the same time, but that also means the enemies are far more aggressive. And you know what? I love that. The action becomes tenser, all different shootout scenarios requires constant movement, and some new enemies like those bull-masked brutes that I don't want to meet in a dark alley. The knife also becomes a more essential tool, used to either parry attacks or escape in the grasp of an enemy. Not to mention it's quite good for the newly implemented stealth kills. In fact, reinforcing the knife has become my #1 priority in the shop, because unlike the original, knives can shatter upon excessive usage. While the game follows the framework of the original, it does remixes some of the level design and even the bosses. Not every change is perfect, as I do think, for example, the minecart section in the original is much more intense and dynamic compared to the rather pedestrian interpretation of the remake. My point is that as great as Resident Evil 4 Remake truly is, it does not, and I repeat, does not invalidate the original game, though I could do without all the QuickTime events. It still remains one of the best games of all time. Think of it like a Fullmetal Alchemist vs Brotherhood situation, where both versions have their merits and they can coexist with one another. I have no idea how Capcom done this, but they've created yet another masterpiece and absolutely outdone themselves. Everything from the production values to the clever gameplay changes, this is a AAA game at its absolute peak. So you know what? No, I don't feel guilty at all placing this game as high as it is. Despite being a remake, it more than earns the #1 spot and it should be celebrated. I don't even know where the Resident Evil franchise can go from here, but you know what? I doubt it can get any better than this.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
So, this is it. This is my top 20 games of 2023 video. And sort of the end of a chapter, which is really weird, but I'm not sure if I can make those kind of videos anymore because they do take a lot of time in terms of editing and of course playing all of the games. A lot of them are just really massive experiences. And I know that this video is late once again. I'm not going to go on with excuses, but I made sure that this particular video is going to come out a little bit late because it is bigger, because there are more bigger titles to talk about and really elaborate on. So this was an exception, and that's kind of the reason why I wasn't sure if I want to make something like that for 2024, because I don't want it to wait until August to make another top 10. So if you do want to see another one of those, I'm open to the feedback, but it might be a more like casual, smaller scale, like me talking unscripted to the camera about some of my favorite games. Nothing like super heavily edited. But nevertheless, I really hope you enjoy this video. I put a lot of effort into it, and it's not like, you know, I'm ending anything in this channel. I'm still gonna make videos, just a bit more personal stuff, a bit more editorial stuff, which I hope you'd also enjoy. But thank you again for being with me on this 10-year journey, and I hope to see you again in the future. Thank you very much, and take care.